In Gilbert and Sullivan's operetta HMS Pinafore, the fun and the craziness begins even before the show starts. It's in the name itself. You know what a pinafore is, don't you? Maybe you don't. I'll bet the dedicated Savoyards amongst you out there, and I know you're listening, I bet you know. But in case you never thought about it, what is a pinafore? Well, it's a frilly girl's apron. So the satire and parody is right there before we even meet the characters. A mighty battleship is named after a girl's apron, which is very typical Gilbertian humor. You know, W.S. Gilbert, and I'll be making a similar point a few minutes from now, kind of casts a long shadow into the 20th century notion of humor. Not only is his kind of absurd nonsense the grandfather of Monty Python's uh, uh, Flying Circus comedy troupe, but really, even this style of naming, I was thinking of other naval comedies that have sort of comically inappropriate names for their ships. There was an American film, a naval comedy called Mr. Roberts, which I think also became a TV series, in which the mighty battleship was called the USS Reluctant, an extremely Gilbertian gesture. So with Gilbert and Sullivan, all is parody, all is satire. I like to make the point, and sometimes people argue with me about this, that even the moments in these operettas which seem expressive and sincere and full of sentiment and passion are really not the case. Everything is parody, everything is comic, and there's not one moment that is really serious in the Gilbertian and Sullivanian universe. I'll try to defend that a few minutes from now. But first, let's identify what is Gilbert making fun of? What are his targets for satire? Well, I think there are four major ones in Pinafore. First of all, and this goes with every kind of story set in England, the British class system. Our opening production of Virginia Opera was set in merry old England. Well, it wasn't so merry, was it? It was kind of bleak. Sondheim's Sweeney Todd. But that dealt with the class system as well. You had the working class barber Sweeney Todd and the aristocratic villain Judge Turpin and the beggar woman who was the street type of person. And we're going to stay in the British Isles, and here we have a complete plot that is hinged around the class system. In that, you have middle-class Captain Corcoran, the leader, the commander of the Pinafore, and his middle-class daughter Josephine. She is betrothed to the aristocratic Sir Joseph Porter. She's going to marry up in class, but she would rather marry down in class to the low-born tar, the common sailor Rafe Rackstraw. And that's no good. Young ladies were not supposed to marry down in class. Do you see a little hypocrisy in that attitude? Yeah, we're going to be talking about that later as well. We'll weigh in with how come that works, that men can marry down and women can't. So, anyway, that's one aspect of the satire. I think we're also taking a look at British military life and discipline. I don't know exactly. Well, that name Pinafore, a mighty battleship being named after a girl's apron, that's already poking fun at British military a little bit. And I don't know if there had been editorials in the newspapers back in the 1870s commenting or criticizing lax standards in military discipline. I don't know, but that seems to be a subject that Gilbert tackles as well, as you will see. The third area is the British government and bureaucracy, always a favorite target. And he has some particularly poisonous arrows to aim at British government in this particular case. And then the fourth is Italian opera. These operettas always like to mock classical music, to imitate, to parody classical music a little bit. And let's face it, Italian opera deserves it. There's so much fodder for satire in the illogic at times of Italian opera that neither Gilbert nor Sullivan can resist just having a bit of fun with that. Well, let's see how these play out. Now, long before Gilbert and Sullivan became a thing. And by the way, HMS Pinafore was the particular work that turned them into a thing. They had collaborated more or less by happenstance or chance on three previous works, such as Trial by Jury and so forth. But this Pinafore was so wildly successful. I mean, it was like an ATM machine spitting out pound notes, and was a raging success all over Britain and the United States as well. That their very canny theatrical producer, Richard Doyleycart, saw that he needed to keep these guys together, and from Pinafore on through the rest of the Gilbert and Sullivan canon, they became the Savoyards that we know. He built the Savoy Theater for them, and they were kind of chained to each other, kind of like, bedfellows more than colleagues at times. But long before Gilbert ever met Sullivan, he was a humorist making a living. There was a British humor magazine, kind of like the magazine you may be familiar with called Punch. Back in the mid-19th century, there was one called Fun. And under a pen name, Bab, Gilbert would submit humorous poems to this magazine. They were called Bab's Ballads. This arose from the fact that his nickname in infancy was Babs. So Bab's Ballads became quite a thing. And later, after he started writing these librettos for Doyleycart and Sullivan, Gilbert would turn back to his Bab's Ballads to find some plot ideas and source material. And actually, there are two of them. I'm just going to read you brief excerpts from a couple of these Bab's Ballads, which came out 10 and 11 years before HMS Pinafore. Pinafore is in 1878. This first one I'm going to read you, The Ballad of General John, came out in 1867, long before. And here we get one of the essential plot points of Pinafore. So it goes like this. The bravest names for fire and flames and all that mortal durst were General John and Private James of the 6071st. General John was a soldier tried, a chief of warlike dons, a haughty stride and a withering pride were Major General John's. A sneer would play on his martial phiz, superior birth to show. There's the class system thing. Pish was a favorite word of his, and he often said, ho, ho. Now, full Private James, described might be, is a man of a mournful mind. No characteristic trait had he of any distinctive kind. From the ranks one day cried Private James, "Oh, Major General John, I've doubts of our respective names my mournful mind upon. A glimmering thought occurs to me, its source I can't unearth, but I've kind of a notion that we were cruelly changed at birth. I've a strange idea that each other's names we've each of us here got on. Such things have been," said Private James. "They have," sneered General John. And it goes on like that. Well, that, of course, is exactly the big plot twist. You always have the big ironic plot twist in Gilbert and Sullivan, don't you? And in the case of Pinafore, of course, it's that Captain Corcoran, the middle-class commander, and low-born Rafe Rackstraw were cruelly changed at birth by their wet nurse called Little Buttercup. And so that instantly the low-born guy becomes middle class and the middle-class guy becomes a commoner. And, of course, the farcical thing in Gilbert and Sullivan is that when this happens, each party just accepts it as the natural course of events. There's no big deal. Oh, okay, well, I'm a commander now. Cool, It's all just silly nonsense. The other poem that I'll share with you, not all of it, but enough to show you the tie-in to this operetta, is called Captain Reese. It came out in 1868. Of all the ships upon the blue, no ship contained a better crew than that of worthy Captain Reese, commander of the Mantelpiece. He was adored by all his men, for worthy Captain Reese, R.N., did all that lay within him to promote the comfort of his crew. If ever they were dull or sad, their captain danced for them like mad, or told, to make the time pass by, droll legends of his infancy. A feather bed had every man, warm slippers and hot water can, brown Windsor from the captain's store, a valet too to every four. Did they with thirst in summer burn? Lo, seltzogenes at every turn, and on all very sultry days, cream ices handed round on trays. Well, this ties into the predicament that poor Captain Corcoran will find himself in HMS Pinafore. And again, the object of the satire here is British military life. That the idea that the commanding officer must bow and scrape to his enlisted men and serve them ice cream and seltzers and give them feather beds. Again, I don't know what the situation was in naval life at this time. There's probably something, I'm just lazy enough that I didn't research this for you, listeners. Sorry. Complain to WHRO. They'll do something about it. But there must have been something going on that caused Gilbert to turn his attention to this, because poor Captain Corcoran gets in trouble if he uses abusive language. In fact, let's start our musical excerpts with his entrance aria, in which he compliments the crew who adore him because he's so nice to them. He compliments them on their unfailing politeness and says that he must be equally polite in return, and so he must never use coarse language such as, and I won't say the word out loud, the FCC might be listening, but as Corcoran refers to it, the big, big D.
I do my best to satisfy you all. You will quite content. You're exceedingly polite, and I think it only right to return the compliment. You're exceedingly polite, and I think it's only right to return the compliment. Bad language or abuse I never use, whatever the emergency. The moment I may occasionally say, I never use a big, big D. What, never? No, never. What, never? Well, hardly ever. Hardly ever says a big, big D. Then give me cheers and one cheer more for the well-bred captain of the Pinafore. Give me cheers and one cheer more. The captain of the Pinafore.
Now, moving on, let's meet the comic baritone of the piece, the role that corresponds to Major General Stanley in Pirates of Penzance. These shows do have a bit of formula, let's admit it. These shows were so commercially successful that Gilbert and Sullivan did kind of stick to a formula. It wasn't broken and they didn't fix it. The patter song, a comic patter song that usually has 187 verses. They never change key, and they're just fun. They're fun to memorize the words to and sing in the shower when you get up in the morning. And we're going to meet Sir Joseph Porter, who is, as he will tell us, the ruler of the Queen's Navy. He is the first Lord of the Royal Admiralty of the Royal Navy, which in America would be Secretary of the Navy. Now, it's very comical. He's going to tell us about how he was appointed to this post through no particular skills of his own. He polished the doorknobs when he was a clerk, and he did such a good job that he became ruler of the Queen's Navy. And, here, we won't listen to all of it, but here's where we get to the real gist of his rise through the ranks of the profession.
Of legal knowledge I acquired such a grip that they took me into the partnership, and that junior partnership, I ween, was the only ship that I ever had seen. The only ship we ever had seen. But that kind of ship so suited me that I am the ruler of the Queen's Navy. But that kind of ship so suited me that now he is the ruler of the Queen's Navy. I grew so rich that I was sent by a pocket borough into Parliament. I always voted at my party's call, and I never thought of thinking for myself at all. You never thought of thinking for yourself at all. I thought so little, they rewarded me by making me the ruler of the Queen's Navy. You thought so little, they rewarded me by making me the ruler of the Queen's Navy. Now, landsmen all, whoever you may be, if you want to rise to the top of the tree, if your soul isn't fettered to an office stool. Be careful to be guided by this golden rule. Stick close to your desks and never go to sea. And you all may be rulers of the Queen's Navy. Stick close to your desks and never go to sea. And you all may be rulers of the Queen's Navy.
Now, that's comical enough. The idea that a guy who had never been on a ship before and never been to sea would wind up being Secretary of the Navy or First Lord of the Admiralty. However, what you have to understand, unless you know what was happening in London when these shows were written, you don't appreciate how poisonous some of this humor is. Because let me tell you about a fella who actually did become the ruler of the Queen's Navy the year before HMS Pinafore came out. Now, in 1878 is the premiere of HMS Pinafore. In 1877, a guy named William Henry Smith became the First Lord of the Admiralty. This guy had entered Parliament in 1868 and, as I said, became the leader of the Navy in 1877. He had never been in the Navy. He had never been to sea. W.H. Smith made a fortune through book selling. He took over his father's book selling business, and he set up kiosks to sell newspapers and books in railway stations, and he became the biggest bookseller and newsagent in all of England. That was his qualification. He was wealthy, and he was powerful and influential. He remained First Lord until the fall of Disraeli's Conservative government in 1880, and wherever he went, because of this unfortunate timing, people hummed Sir Joseph's song. In fact, and this is pathetic, you have to feel sorry for Mr. Smith. When I Was a Lad was played by a Royal Marine Band when Smith went down to launch a ship at Devonport, even though the Home Office had given strict orders that music from Pinafore should on no account be performed. Now, was Gilbert being cruel to make fun of W.H. Smith? You can actually make the case that he was not making fun of Smith personally. It just was kind of a little coincidence. In fact, Smith wrote a letter to Sullivan in which he was concerned that people would assume that Sir Joseph was W.H. Smith. So he tried to, obviously Smith was a pretty buttoned-up conservative. Gilbert tried to make Sir Joseph rather liberal in his views so that people would think that can't possibly be Smith, but of course he failed miserably and he was known as Pinafore Smith. Really the object of the satire here is the British system of rewarding wealthy people with military commissions for which they had no merit-based qualifications. Does that only happen in England in the 19th century? Well, I don't know. Do presidents ever appoint ambassadors to remote islands, in the tropics, to people who stroked large checks for their campaign? Yeah, maybe that happens sometimes. So it's just sort of how government works. And so that satire still retains a little bit of bite and relevance today, doesn't it? Well, we've taken a look at 3 of the 4 objects of satire, the class system, military life, the government and appointment of posts and so forth. How about that Italian opera? Well, I've got one example now, and then there will be another one a bit later. Recitative. Can we talk about recitative, as the late Joan Rivers would have said? You go to an opera by Rossini or Mozart, and you have to wade through pages of sung dialogue. Oh, Susanna, have you seen the Count lately? No, I think he's down in the garden. Oh, then we must fetch the cook because he wants tenderloin for dinner, blah, 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 blah. And it's not a song, it's not music, and you have to... if you're like me, you're in the audience thinking, can we please get to the aria? Can we just get to the aria? So in Act 2, poor Josephine, who is bereft, I tell you, because she does not want to marry this old man with tobacco breath, Sir Joseph. She wants to marry the cute sailor Rafe. And she's going to sing a song in which she pours out her heart. And there is going to be some recitative. And in this recitative, it's going to get quite wordy, and apparently the only thing that matters to Josephine is that her recitative rhymes.
And on the other, a dark and dingy room in some back street with stuffy children crying, where organs yell and clanging housepipes fume, and clothes are hanging out all day and drying, with one great-looking glass to see your face in, and a dinner served up in a pudding basin.
Now, think about what you just heard. Did it sound vaguely familiar? Do you feel like you've ever heard passages like that before? Let me ask you this. Have you ever read any Ogden Nash? Now, most of us are quite familiar with Ogden Nash's humorous American poetry. I'm not so sure it's so American, except in with the subjects he writes about. You may have thought Ogden Nash was an original, but as far as I'm concerned, everything Ogden Nash wrote stems from what you just heard, passages like that by W.S. Gilbert. Here's a little bit of an excerpt from an Ogden Nash poem about marriage that's called I Do, I Will, I Have. Just as I know that there are two Hagens, Walter and Copen, I know that marriage is a legal and religious alliance entered into by a man who can't sleep with the window shut and a woman who can't sleep with the window open. Moreover, just as I am unsure of the difference between flora and fauna and flotsam and jetsam, I am quite sure that marriage is the alliance of two people, one of whom never remembers birthdays and the other never forgets them. Long words with no meter or rhythm whatsoever, and the only issue is, does it rhyme? So you see, as I said earlier, I think W.S. Gilbert in many ways casts a long, long shadow into the 20th century. Now, I said earlier that in my opinion, there is never a serious moment in Gilbert and Sullivan. When we did Mikado a few seasons back, I was making this argument, and I had some people who kind of gave me some feedback, and they weren't happy with that. They thought that Katisha's aria in the second act of Mikado was, a moment of real humanity in Sullivan's music, a moment in which there is heartfelt emotion, and I say the joke is on you. You have to understand W.S. Gilbert's theory of comedy. It's called topsy-turvy. In topsy-turvy comedy, you start with an absurd premise. And of course, there are many absurd premises in this story, one of which is that this being switched at birth, that a middle-class person can instantly switch social classes with a commoner. And it goes on from there. If the premise is absurd, then nothing that happens in the story can be serious. That doesn't make sense. And what Gilbert insisted with his players is that they play it straight, that they not wink and nudge and let on to the audience, that they never break character. And you must understand, Gilbert was the stage director for his shows as well as the librettist. And he revolutionized English comic acting because prior to Gilbert, these comedians would break character constantly. If they said something funny, got a good laugh, they'd turn to the audience and say, "Oh, did you like that one? Did you? There's an even better one coming up. Wait till you hear the next one." Gilbert said, none of it. You must trust the material, stay in character, and play it straight. So what he wanted them to understand is that you and I must realize that the characters are in absurd situations, but the characters don't. To the characters, their problems are just as serious as Aida's problems are in Verdi's Aida. And what's wonderful about Arthur Sullivan is that he got this. Sullivan's music plays it straight. Now, following that Ogden Nash style recitative that we just heard comes Josephine's aria, A Simple Sailor. I'm going to play you the end of this aria, the sort of the return to the A section and the conclusion. And if you didn't know what this was, if you knew nothing about the characters and you're just listening to the music, it sounds like a heartfelt, impassioned soprano aria out of central casting. You would never know that beneath it lies an absurd premise, but that's because Sullivan is assisting the soprano in playing it straight. The music does not break character. So there you have no winking, no breaking character, but it sounds serious. My hypothesis is that this is still making fun of opera because, it's sort of like that old saying, is your house built on solid rock or sinking sand? In my analogy, an absurd premise, nonsensical characters and nonsensical problems are sinking sand so that there cannot be serious expression on top of them. So that's a very subtle thing that I think is my favorite part of Gilbert and Sullivan. Now, let's go back to a problem that I posed earlier in our broadcast as we take a look at Gilbert and Sullivan's HMS Pinafore prior to Virginia Opera's opening night, which I expect to see you at. Josephine is middle class. She's going to, as the drama opens, she's going to marry up in class and become aristocratic by marrying the aristocratic Sir Joseph. She would like to marry down in class to the commoner Rafe. That's not okay. A proper young woman it would be scandalous for her to marry down beneath her social class. So how come it's okay for Sir Joseph to do that? How come men can marry beneath their social class? How does that work? Who made up those rules? I thought that was kind of an interesting issue, actually. So I consulted a friend of mine who's kind of an expert in these things. I wish she could be here today, but I'm going to speak for her. I have a friend named Duana Welch. Duana is a recognized national expert in the field of marriage, love, romance, and sexuality. She teaches psychology in Austin, Texas. She is a columnist. She often contributes to Psychology Today and to eHarmony. And she's got a book coming out called Love Factually, which is a kind of a science-based method of finding a mate, finding romantic happiness and a stable marriage. And Duana also has a blog that's kind of like an old-fashioned Dear Abby advice to the lovelorn column. It's called lovesciencemedia.com. And people write to Duana asking questions about their relationships, their boyfriends, their mother-in-laws, all those messy relationship problems. And instead of basing her answers on, good old common sense, Duana actually refers to the body of scientific research in the field. So I put this question to Duana. How come it was okay for women to, not okay for women to marry below their social standing, but it was for men? And she wrote me back, and I'm going to read her answer. Duana said, "Now, while I have never written on the topic directly, I've often indirectly addressed it via something called assortative mating, also known as the matching phenomenon. Basically, the more alike two people are, not only in physical appearance, but in nearly every way, the happier they are together. Couples with more similarities are not only more likely to begin dating than people who are dissimilar, but they are also more likely to keep dating, fall in love, get engaged, get married, and stay happily wed. It is a phenomenon that has now been validated in more than 37 cultures and countries. So it turns out that, remember when your mother told you opposites attract? Yeah, not so much. So Dana continues, the upshot is, most of the time when folks marry, they do so in their own social class, just as they usually marry someone who is otherwise similar. But when there is a violation of similarity in terms of social class, it tends to be a case of a young, beautiful woman who marries an older, less attractive but wealthy man. And this is still a match. Why? What do men value? Youth and beauty. What do women value? Resources. So if folks are going to make a trade, that seems to be the one that works out. And that would have been the scenario if Josephine had married Sir Joseph. She would have attained his status in society and had access to his wealth, and he would have had a nice young trophy wife, a beautiful, glamorous girl to take about town on his arm. As it turns out, Josephine gets the best of both worlds, because once she is able to marry Rafe, then he is suddenly above her in social class because they've switched. She's the commoner, he's the middle class, so she's still going up in class. She also gets the cute guy. There's an Act 2 trio with the captain, his daughter, and Sir Joseph. Sir Joseph has come to Captain Corcoran kind of upset because it has come to his attention that Josephine is a bit reluctant to tie the knot with him. He doesn't understand why she would not leap at the chance to become Mrs. Joseph Porter. And kind of tap dancing, trying not to be to be offensive to his superior, the captain says, "Well, sir, I'm sure she's just intimidated by your majesty and glory. I mean, after all, you're so grand." So in this trio, Sir Joseph wants to reassure Josephine, and he says, "Oh, no, when it comes to matters of the heart, social standing should never stand in the way. You don't even worry about it that you're middle class. The heart wants what the heart wants," and so forth. Well, of course, they're talking at cross purposes, because Josephine is going to interpret this differently. Sir Joseph means, because social standing doesn't matter, you can feel free not to feel intimidated and go ahead and marry me. Josephine is thinking, oh, social class doesn't matter, so I can marry Rafe. And they're kind of talking in circles in this particular verse of the trio.
Never mind the why and wherefore, love can level ranks and therefore, though your nautical relation in my set could scarcely pass, though you occupy a station in the lower middle class.
Ring the very bells of lordship, and there with public while, all union of the lordship with a humble captain's child, or a humble captain's daughter,
For a gallant captain's daughter,
And a lord who rules the water,
and a tar who plows the water.
let's hear with joy the little ring the songs they ever won, for the union of the little women who once her love.
Yeah, you heard Sir Joseph mention the Lord who plows the water, and Josephine is talking about the Lord who rules the water, and Josephine talks about the tar who plows the water. So we're at cross purposes. There's a big mix-up, and it's going to come to a head. Josephine, thus emboldened by Sir Joseph's liberal views on the British class system, is going to go ahead and marry her boy. They're going to elope. It might be okay with Sir Joseph in her view, but Daddy is not going to approve. So they're going to sneak off the ship in the middle of the night, and the crew is going to help them because the crew loves Rafe. He's their favorite. He's the smartest lad in the whole fleet, of course. So this gives rise to another opportunity to make a little bit of fun of Italian opera. Now, You know, I'm an opera composer, I'm an opera scholar, an opera lecturer, and I have no idea why Italian composers love to write choruses in which men are tiptoeing. It's a thing. Uh, if there's a doctoral student in musicology out there, I think this would be subject for a dissertation. Let's count up exactly how many whispering, tiptoeing choruses there are in Italian opera. I thought of two off the top of my head. At the top of the show of Barbara of Seville in Act One, there's a group of musicians who are tiptoeing underneath Dr. Bartolo's house in the wee hours of the morning in order to serenade Rosina, and they're singing piano, pianissimo, quiet, don't wake up the neighborhood. There's one. In Verdi's Rigoletto, the Duke of Mantua wants to canoodle with Rigoletto's daughter Gilda, so he orders his courtiers to to abduct the girl in the middle of the night. And, of course, you know, they don't want to advertise this, so they're going to be tiptoeing, telling each other quiet, zitti, zitti, silence, silence. Now, did you notice the little quirk in that Verdi excerpt that where they're all trying to be as quiet as possible, and yet Verdi, for some reason, to be a little bit devilish, occasionally has the kettle drums come out with a mighty roar and have the boys suddenly speak something very sharply and then return to their whispering. Well, Sullivan saw ripe material for satire here. As the crew of the Pinafore, all of them, Little Buttercup, everybody except Dick Deadeye, the pirate-like sailor who's kind of the rat-fink who squeals the elopement plan to the captain. But everybody else on board is trying to help Rafe and Josephine sneak off the ship to elope, and they're going to be tiptoeing and being it's like Elmer Fudd in those Warner Brothers cartoons, be very, very quiet as he sneaks up on Bugs with his shotgun. And of course, the humor arises when they fail miserably to remain quiet.
Again that cat. It was again that cat. They're right. It was the cat.
Hansel and Gretel in Humperdinck's opera said, "It must be the wind." Dick Deadeye says, "It must be the cat that made that loud noise." And this is something that Sullivan, he couldn't let go of it. In Pirates of Penzance, their next show, he had to return to this. And when the men's chorus is, this is just so, this is my favorite thing. You know, years ago, Virginia Opera did a Family Day production of Pirates in which I got to be the pirate Samuel. And It's just such fun to sing this with cat-like tread when the pirates are trying to tiptoe to do some pirating, and they do it at the top of their lungs.
With cat-like tread upon a brave we speed, in silent dread, a cautious way we feel. No sound at all, we never speak a word, a fly's foot forward in this game we heard. So stealthily the pirate creeps, while all the house with sound receives.
So take that, Verdi and Rossini. Now, Daddy does leap out and try to, what's the meaning of this? Where do you think you're going, you young people? But the crew leaps to Rafe's defense. And their point is, of course, Rafe Rackstraw, it doesn't matter, he's a commoner. Of course, he's good enough for your daughter. And why is that? Because after all, he is an Englishman. And this is an iconic moment in HMS Pinafore. This is a moment in which Sullivan and Gilbert together accomplish a neat trick to glorify British patriotism at the same time that we mock it. Listen to the words carefully. Now those words, yes, we're still being absurd, for in spite of all temptations to belong to other nations, he remains an Englishman. Oh, well, good for him. But do you see something else? There are sort of levels in which we process, layers in which we process this material. There's something undeniably stirring there. If you're a native-born Britisher, doesn't your heart swell a little bit? Doesn't your pulse beat a little faster? Don't your eyes dilate? Doesn't this appeal to that? This goes all the way back to Shakespearean times. That passage we just heard always makes me think of that moment in Richard II from Act 2, Scene 1, when John of Gaunt says these immortal words, "This royal throne of kings, this sceptred isle, this earth of majesty, this seat of Mars, this other Eden demi-paradise, this fortress built by nature for herself against infection and the hand of war, this happy breed of men, this little world, this precious stone set in the silver sea, which serves it in the office of a wall or as a moat defensive to a house against the envy of less happier lands, this blessed plot, this earth, this realm, this England." Yeah, there's that business there. There's something real there, except, again, you never lose the little bit of parody, the little bit of absurdity in the words. And there's something else going on as well. D'Oyly Carte, Sullivan, and Gilbert had a mission above and beyond making money. They wanted to create an English school of comic opera. Now, if you've taken any music history, you know that the 19th century, the mid to late 19th century, was a time of nationalism in Western Europe. For far too long, the Italians, the French, the Germans had dominated art music. At this point, Russia and Spain and the other Slavic countries, Hungary and Czechoslovakia, and for their turn, Britain, wanted to create national musical styles in which they had been lacking. Sullivan was the great white hope of English music. We're talking about a culture in which the most prominent composers had been John Blow, Thomas Arne, and Henry Purcell. Fine musicians, but not of the stature of Mozart, Clementi, Verdi, Puccini. Well, Puccini's later to come, but Schumann, Mendelssohn, Schubert, Donizetti, Rossini, all the rest. They wanted Sullivan to create English music. He and some of his colleagues, like those to come, Elgar and so forth. Well, think about that anthem that we just heard. For he is an Englishman. It doesn't sound Italian, does it? It doesn't sound French, does it? He kind of succeeded, didn't he? There is kind of an English-sounding style to that. Now, what makes it sound? Why doesn't it sound Italian? Well, Italian music is kind of emotional. German music is rather complex and contrapuntal. There's, polyphonic fugues and so forth. What are the British? They're dignified. They're formal. They have a stiff upper lip. I like to say, if Queen Elizabeth is trying to catch a bus and the bus is pulling away from the bus stop, does Queen Elizabeth go, "Wait, come back"? No. Queen Elizabeth will say, "Driver, halt." This is the British thing, this extreme dignity. I think that's what Sullivan captures in that little march-like anthem that we just heard. And a few years later, maybe just half a generation later, we would hear this same character in a particular march that you may be familiar with. Yeah, so there it is. Between them, Sullivan and Elgar, they're creating out of thin air, out of pure imagination, a dignified, formal, stiff upper lip, essentially British musical style, right? Actually, no. And I hate to point this out. It pains me. But this essentially British style was actually originated by a German from Saxony, and that would be George Friedrich Handel, the naturalized British citizen who came to London to stay fairly early in his career, wrote Italian operas until the public tired of them, and then started writing starchy, dignified English oratorios. This style that you hear in Elgar and in For He is an Englishman, this is very Handelian. Have you ever heard that Handel's Largo that junior piano students love to play? Dee tom 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 ta ti, dee ta 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 ta. Well, actually, let's have Bryn Terfel sing another example. Here's a little bit of an aria, Where'er You Walk, from the opera Semele.
Thunder gray, trees where you sit shall crowd into a shade. Trees crowd into a shade.
So there you have it. Now, I think it would be up to 20th century composers like Vaughan Williams, Finzi, Holst, and others to create an actual folk song-based English musical language that is an even more authentic expression of English nationalism. Well, the last thing I want to show you today, I guess, is Little Buttercup's song. Kind of a throwaway number. Little Buttercup, she is the vendor, the bumboat woman. A bumboat was like a small craft, like a canoe. Bum is the Dutch word for a tree, a boat carved out of a tree. She was the matronly lady who would come out to the ship in her canoe, selling supplies for the sailors, and they would spend their wages on her sausages and so forth. And she has a song in which she introduces herself. Little Buttercup seems unduly concerned that we know what her name is. She says it over and over in a song which is kind of ironically coy and girlish for a woman of such, well, let's say robust matronly physical appearance.
I'm called Little Buttercup, dear Little Buttercup, though I could never tell why. But still I'm called Buttercup, poor Little Buttercup, sweet Little Buttercup I snuff and tobacco, an excellent Jackie, I've scissors and watches and knives. I've ribbons and laces to set off the faces of pretty young sweethearts and wives. I've treacle and toffee, I've tea and I've coffee, soft Tommy and succulent chops. I've chickens and conies and pretty balloonies and excellent peppermint drops. Then buy of your buttercup, dear little buttercup, sailors should never be shy.
All right, now let me tell you a theory that I have about this song. As a piece of music, how would you rate it? You know, I've been teaching lifelong learning classes for the past several weeks, since August, on HMS Pinafore. And I was using a DVD of a live performance by an Australian company. And it was a fairly traditional, conventional staging in terms of acting and music, except for Little Buttercup, in whom they hired a comedian who bellowed and yelled and mugged her way through that song. At times she sounded like Carol Burnett doing her Tarzan impression, screaming and so forth. It was something that would have made W.S. Gilbert want to kill himself, frankly, or kill the artist. And I was wondering, why did they make that choice? Why didn't they cast it with a traditional contralto, as in the excerpt that you just heard? Here's my theory. All right, that melody, da 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 da. With fairly basic, first year at the piano chord progressions in the accompaniment. What is the intrinsic musical value of that song? How would you rate it among, Sullivan's solos? Is it toe-tapping? Is it rollicking? Is it impassioned? No, it's pretty... Look, I don't want to make the Savoyards amongst you angry with me. So, understand, I do think Sullivan is a genius, and I think there's genius at work here, in spite of the fact that I would use the word insipid for Little Buttercup's song. Now the question, so I think that in the DVD that I mentioned, I think they made that choice because they thought, this is the first solo in the show and it's a dead spot. We'd better at least make it funny. So they went for over-the-top kind of modern style of humor. So now my question becomes, Why did Sullivan make this choice? He's perfectly capable, obviously, of writing sparkling melodies, of writing music that's amusing. Why did he take that kind of bland tone? I think it was a calculated business decision. And here's what I mean. This is a musical, okay? Forget, this is not the Ring Cycle. This was a money-making proposition. They wanted people to pony up and buy tickets at the box office. And that's what all composers want for their musicals. But they also want them to be able to produce revenue outside of the theater. There should be ways of making money with music outside of ticket sales. Now, today we have all sorts of electronic ways to enjoy music at the home. If you like the Book of Mormon or Hedgewick and the Angry Inch or some of the contemporary musicals, what do? You download the cast album onto your iPod, you pay for that, and then you listen to it as you sweat on the treadmill or go about your housework. And money is made, commerce happens. If there's a revenue stream outside of ticket sales. All right, let's go back a little bit. Let's go back to what many consider the heyday of American musical theater, which might be in the 40s and 50s when you have giants like Rodgers and Hammerstein and Frank Loesser. Well, no iPods, we don't have all the electronic marvels. We did have record players, and we had radio. Now, there's a popular style, the big band style, at work in the 40s and 50s. I believe that Rodgers and Frank Loesser and the others, I think that they chose certain songs to be written in the popular style of the day, styles that would correspond to what Tommy Dorsey and Bing Crosby and Ella Fitzgerald were doing on the radio, so that those songs would be plugged and they would be played by radio stations, and the records would be sold, and commerce would happen, and money would be made. Here's an example from Guys and Dolls. Here's Sister Sarah's little flirtatious, tipsy song, If I Were a Belle.
Ask me, how do I feel? Ask me now that we're fondly caressing. Pal, if I were a salad, I know I'd be splashing my dressing. Ask me how to describe this whole beautiful thing. Well, if I were a bell, I'd go ding, dong, ding.
That's a song that was destined to become popular. In fact, Ella Fitzgerald made a very fine recording of that song. And, Frank Sinatra recorded Luck Be a Lady and so forth. So this is a way of achieving popularity outside of the theater. Well, opera composers do that. Verdi did that in Rigoletto. He wanted La Donna Immobile to be a hit, that all the street vendors would be playing on their organ grinders within a few weeks. Well, it's the same with Sir Arthur Sullivan. But what was home entertainment in 1878? No radio, no record players. You know what it was? It was sheet music. You've got parlor music. WHRO, perhaps you listened to Dwight Davis's Music from the Parlor on Sunday afternoons. This was how people entertained themselves before the electronic age. You'd have your lovely teenage daughter, Mary Margaret. She's 13. Mama is training her to be wife material. She's learning needlework. She can bake a pie. She can roast a leg of lamb. And she can play and sing a little bit. So on Sunday after church, after dinner, Uncle Leroy and Aunt Matilda and Father and Mother and little Junior, gather around the piano, and Mary has something she can play. It's not too difficult. It's something she can handle. It doesn't go fast. It has simple chords, and it has nice fun words like, I have plenty of tobacco and nice beef jacky, da, 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 da. And it's amusing words. Everybody can have a nice time gathering around the piano, singing together. And this is called parlor music. I found a YouTube video of a 13-year-old girl playing Little Buttercup's song on the piano. And this is, she's reading from music. Well, that music cost something. It wasn't free. This is what was happening in home entertainment. On the American shores, we had a guy named Stephen Collins Foster. Now, if you've still got Little Buttercup's song in your ear that we heard a moment ago, compare it with this for simplicity of melody and clarity of the accompaniment.
Beautiful dreamer, wake unto me. Starlight and dewdrops are waiting for.
So if you have ever found yourself a little impatient during Buttercup's song and thinking, yeah, get off the stage, I want to hear Sir Joseph. Arthur Sullivan, you had a weak moment there. That wasn't your best moment. Oh no, Arthur Sullivan always knows what he's doing, and I think that was a song calculated to provide a few additional shillings in addition to the mountain of pound notes that came through the ticket sales. Well, I've kind of told you what I want to tell you, what I want to share with you about how I see HMS Pinafore. It's all for laughs. It's all satire. It's all silly, absurdist nonsense. This is not Die Fledermaus or Oklahoma or Babes in Toyland or The Merry Widow, which have real sentiment, which are situation comedy. This is Monty Python. This is topsy-turvy to some of the most inspired comic music ever written. You know you don't want to miss it. You know you want to come to the Harrison Opera House. I'll see you there.
A British tar is a soaring soul, as free as a mountain bird. His energetic fist should be ready to resist a dictatorial word. His nose should burn, and his lips should curl, his cheek should flame, and his brow should frown, his bosom should ease, and his heart should glow, and his fist be ever ready for the blow. His nose should pant, and his lips should curl, his cheek